Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joseph Aquilina, Senior Director and Associate General Counsel with Consumer Brands Association. We're excited to have you join us for today's session on industry insights, crisis-proofing your customer relationships. This series provides overviews on a broad range of topics that are crucially important to the CPG industry. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone's line was muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question or comment during the course of today's session, please submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've saved some time at the end to make sure that we can get through those and hear from your perspectives and questions. So let's dive right into today's content. From social to political issues to product safety recalls, consumer brands have to face and be prepared to face a range of challenges and potential solutions around crisis and reputation management. These events and how you handle them can really be defining, either strengthening your relationship with your customers or potentially breaking it. And unfortunately, even the most prepared of brands are going to commit some missteps along the way. So from their decades of experience advising executives through high-profile crisis events, we're really fortunate to be joined by Beth Siff and Heather Wilson, who are going to be sharing actionable best practices and cautionary tales from behind the scenes. It's nowhere more clear than with crisis management that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to our friends from Premier Response. Beth Siff, Executive Vice President of Consumer Engagement and co-founder of Premier Response, who's spent decades leading consumer affairs and contact center strategies for some of the world's most trusted brands. I'm so glad to have you here. We also have Heather Wilson joining us. She serves as the Managing Director and Head of Crisis and Litigation at Trail Runner International, who's led major global brands through crisis and litigation communication strategies for the better part of 20 years. So we're really pleased to have two of the best and brightest to be with us today. Beth and Heather, I'm going to turn it over to you and stop back in when it's time to kind of navigate some of those questions. So please.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Appreciate it. We are thrilled to be here and nice to meet all of you, virtually meet all of you, and welcome to the conversation. As advertised, we really believe that a crisis is absolutely your opportunity to build a relationship, build loyalty with your consumers, and how you choose to handle things is either going to get them to stay with you and to engage and to forgive and then stay with the brand, or it's going to be that opportunity where they lose faith in you, you lose their trust, and they leave the brand. And so we want to talk about how to sort of crisis-proof things and steps and tips and things you can consider and think of. And Heather comes at it from the PR and legal side, and I come at it from the consumer affairs side. And together, the having that kind of folks, those kind of folks on your team, and having a broad team representing every group in the organization that's impacted is so critical for the success of your event. So we're going to talk through all of that today. When we talk about these things, we want to be sure that you know what you do in the event of an event. And so are you that person? Are you the one who pushes the panic button? Is that where you lead, how you lead? I know that years ago, for the very first crisis that we ever had to handle, we did that. We got a call from a company that was going to be on the news, and they didn't know what to do. And we were new in the crisis business. This is 20-something years ago. And we said, anyone we know, can you be on the phone in about 4 hours? Because we're going to do some fast training and help this company out. And so we came at it from a panic mode. Obviously, you never want to do that. We ended up working out in the end. I can tell you later about how that went. But are you running with scissors? Are you jumping right in and going for the event? Are you just frozen with fear and you can't take any action? Are you just following orders? Who are you in that world, or are you none of those? Let's start with what a crisis is and what it can be about. We often call crises high volume events. And part of that is because it's not always necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes your brand is blowing up in a positive way and volume is increasing, and you have to create a group to be able to support that. But then there are the things that are the standards that we know about, right? So the product recalls and the data breaches and I know, Heather, you and I were talking about particularly the current, political backlash and polarizing social scene. And I don't know, I know you wanted to share a fun story about that.
Yeah, there's certainly on the political backlash, and I think it sort of extends to this canceling that happens to a lot of brands where, I've gotten a lot of questions because I work in PR as to issues going on, obviously, with Israel and Hamas right now on when is it relevant or is it relevant for a brand to make a comment? And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And you don't want to create a crisis by entering that conversation or not entering it. As I think we've seen if we take the Israel issue, there's been some universities that have gotten themselves in hot water over that. So sometimes even being silent on certain issues can actually create your own crisis. On the canceling, I think there are situations where I had a client many years ago, a very large consumer brand in the food and beverage space, where this was when they did step into and created their own. And the reason I'm not saying their name is NDAs are forever, as I'm sure all of you know. So they had created, one of their many brands had created a app for the iPhone that was meant to be tongue-in-cheek, but unfortunately it was a bit chauvinistic, perhaps even bordering on misogynistic. And it was an app, I'm trying to be very careful so I don't give away the brand name, that would basically coach the user on joking pickup lines and date places to take the women target that were featured, the stereotypes that were featured in this app. And no one knew that this very, very large company owned this particular brand. It was kind of a small, less known brand. And one of their communications marketing people at the time, there was backlash against the creation of this app, decided to tweet, it was Twitter then, basically, sorry if this offended anyone, which is a non-apology, and then hashtag name of this company fails. So connected the parent company with this brand that probably no one knew this big company owned them. So immediately the large company is now front and center on this problem, and it becomes a much bigger issue because of his non-apology. Fast forward, we get asked what should they do? Our counsel is take it off the iPhone app, take it off the App Store. They did not do that. They let it sit there for another 2 weeks for various reasons. It got worse. More and more attention came to it. And what could have been a quiet exit that wouldn't have been such an issue became actually a big problem, where there was boycotts were being called against the parent company. There was tons of angry social media and news articles about the company. It finally got to the CEO, who was a woman at the time, and her response was, we could do better. We need to get rid of this. At that point, 2 weeks later, we get asked, what should we do? My advice was what it was 2 weeks prior, which is take it off the iPhone App Store. And understand now, because it's been 2 weeks, you could have done it quietly 2 weeks ago and probably 5 people would have noticed. Now that there's been boycott calls, it's going to be a news story that you pulled it from the Apple Store, but it's the right thing to do. So as predicted, they did pull it. We helped them with a statement, and it did create another bump in negative stories, but it at least went away. So that's a mini example of how, a self-inflicted wound, but definitely I think when you get into social, political, because that was not necessarily fully political or social, but content of the app was not super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that everywhere. And that's just such a great example of so many things that we're going to talk about in terms of different roles and how these unintended consequences and things blowing up. But that sort of covered sort of the media attention and a bunch of other crises that we have listed here. We were also thinking about the event that happened recently with the beer company, where they identified a spokesperson who is of the times, and that became very polarizing for some of their consumers. the other half who didn't necessarily agree, and other celebrities who didn't agree, and how that company chose to lean in or not lean in and support their original marketing decision was very interesting, and it kind of blew up and became news, and for a very, very long time. When we look at that as an interesting case of how maybe not to handle something, and it could have been handled in a more elegant way. So we will talk about all of those things, but these are just some of the things that we have experienced with crisis. And you may have others, and you're welcome certainly to comment in chat, and we'd love to learn more about that and talk more about that during the course of the conversation today. So what we are going to do is really walk you through these 6 considerations of things to think about as you are going through leading and managing crisis in your organization. And we will focus on the human element first. And we wanted to share this fun little pictorial, this little cartoon, because we really think that this kind of sums it up. And I'll just sort of read it, even though I know you are all probably reading it, but we'll form our usual crisis team to handle the problem. Andy will head up fruitless bickering. Mary, I'd like you to coordinate all blame shifting. Ed, of course, will oversee stonewalling. And Maureen, you will be the quiet, patient voice of reason we eventually listen to after trying everything else. So I don't know who's in your organization and who the Andys and Marys and Eds are. And hopefully you have many Maureens. Maybe you're the Maureen in the organization. But we know hopefully that you actually have a crisis team. And there's probably a lot of personalities on that team. We hope that your consumer is at the center of your team. And here's some of the groups, right, within the organization that are on your crisis team. If you would, we do have one request in chat. If you do not have a crisis team, please note that in chat. Just tell us if you do not have a crisis team. If you do, that's great. You should. And usually these are all of the groups that are represented. And when we say outside advisors, so we mean vendor partners and business partners and other guidance of people you're bringing in. Maybe it's just for crisis support, or maybe it's folks you work with on a regular basis, but you leverage what they bring to the table during an event. The C-suite may be everybody in your C-suite, maybe just your CFO or COO, or it could be the whole group. And so who's missing? Who's not on the list? Again, throw that in chat if you have any comments of who you don't see here on the list. As we were talking about this, and as Heather and I have gone into different companies, and not necessarily together either, on our own with work that we do independently, it's interesting because this is typically the standard team that we meet when we're working with an organization. And the first question I always ask is, where's your consumer affairs team or customer care team at the table? And why aren't they at the table? Because typically they're going to be the group that's going to be supporting this event from that consumer experience. And yet they're not here. Where's IT? Where's HR? Who else is missing, Heather?
Exactly. And I think it also depends on the crisis, because sometimes it shifts. If it's a cybersecurity issue, that's probably could be a different subset. You hopefully have IT in there, and maybe your CISO as well. And if you're having a labor issue, either strikes or RIFs, HR should hopefully be involved in that. So it will vary depending on the crisis. But I would say if you're a consumer brand, you always have to think about the consumer, even if it is a labor issue, because if it's in the news, there's been a lot of strikes in the news of late. If you're GM or Ford, you do have to worry about the people buying your cars while those strikes were going on, because people read the news and people care about these things. So while it will morph depending on the crisis and people kind of come in and come out, you always do want to think about that. And one quick case I would like to share on the human element is when you're dealing with a crisis, it's also think about the literal human element, because depending on what the problem is, your product or something that happened could actually be affecting real people's lives. And I always remind clients when we're thinking about the communication response that we need to think about the humans involved, whether it is the employees that are being directly affected, if it's a labor issue, or if there's a product issue, if anyone has been injured, or God forbid, killed by the product, like think about taking care of those people. And obviously, on a broader point, making sure that the people who interact day to day with your consumers are armed with the right communications material so they understand how to handle, how to triage things and things like that. But I would say at the end of the day, think about how you yourself would want to be treated when there's a problem and what you would need to feel good about the brand and what they're doing for you when there's a problem. That's what I always coach my clients on when we're dealing with something, because at the end of the day, how you treat the people is will kind of make or break you as a brand, which is not probably news breaking, but I think sometimes when we're in a panic, in a crisis, we sometimes forget that everybody we're dealing with is actually a human being. So.
Yeah, that is so critical. And what's important is you want everyone singing off the same hymnal. And, if your culture is the culture where you are a sharing culture and a caring culture, that shouldn't disappear just because you're in a crisis. In fact, that should be really elevated because you're having an event. And each of the departments that are represented and the ones that are not, that should be, are all working in tandem to make sure that that message is consistent. And they're going back to their groups to reassure them. I mean, it tests the mettle of your organization, and how will we get through this together? And are we caring for our consumers? Are we caring for our employees? Are we caring for the quality team who's impacted because something happened on their watch? Are we caring for compliance and following the rules so we're not putting ourselves in danger? And are we listening to the advice of the legal team, but gently pushing back maybe if we have to? What about finances? Are we in control? And are we being smart about all of this? So it is really important. Every group affects each other and has to be moving along together to make it work successfully. You don't want one overshadowing another, although we do want to talk about that because we know everyone plays a role and everyone sometimes approaches things from this perspective. And you've seen it, we've seen it, we know it's out there, so we want to call it out. And we really kind of want to talk through it. And I think the example you gave earlier, Heather, is such a perfect example of all of these points in this.
For sure. And I think when you're thinking about, going back to that cartoon that was shared earlier, when you're thinking about who goes on your crisis team, and it's always good to do this when you're not in a panic mode. I always counsel clients, we prepare the crisis plan in peacetime. So we're all thinking of sound mind and body, but who's on the crisis team? Oftentimes we advise to not have your CEO on the team. They obviously will be advised. The crisis team will advise them, but someone has to be running the day-to-day of the company. And also there's a default that everyone will listen to the CEO. Mm-hmm. So, because as I said, depending on the crisis, it may change who's in charge. If it's a cybersecurity issue, your CISO may be the one who needs to take the lead. If it's a labor issue, your head of people might be the one. And you want to think that through in advance because you don't want to have what I call the Al Haig moment. For anyone who's old enough to remember Reagan and what happened when President Reagan was shot. For those of you who perhaps were born after the 80s, I'll give you a quick. Al Haig just apparently was unfamiliar with how the Constitution works and who takes charge of the country if the president is incapacitated, and he decided that he was in control, and he forgot about the House speakers of the House and things and the vice president. And we don't want to have that. And that happens very quickly in a vacuum, which is why you want to think through in advance who will be in charge of the crisis team. And again, it may change depending because the reasons that are listed on here, you want to minimize some of these things as much as possible, and thinking through some of these in advance can be a good way to do that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And everyone is going to have their feelings and everyone's going to have their behavior that they have. So it's a question of who's going to sort of be that Maureen, that calm voice of reason that acknowledges the fear and maybe some of the loudness. We hear you, and here's how we're going to go through this and make it all happen. I wanted to give an example about control, because this is sort of an interesting thing where oftentimes we know the crisis team comes together, they put the plan together, and they want to control information, and they want to control what's handed out and when people know things. And we recently supported a product recall where the product, 100% of the product was going to be recalled. The company knew this, but wanted to limit information and when they would share that information. They were working with a regulatory body, so they had that piece they had to manage. They were working with a distribution network. They had to manage that piece of communication, plus an outsourcer to be able to handle the contacts, and their internal team, which normally handled contacts from consumers. And so the company, because they weren't quite listening to the advice of folks who normally do this, and this was the first experience they had, and they were letting their C-suite drive the conversation, it kind of got a little messy. And so they decided, we're going to issue what we call a stop order. We're going to tell our retail partners to stop selling, just hold the product, stop selling it. We're not going to really tell you why and what action we're going to take. And so that happened first. And that was because somebody wanted to control the narrative and the conversation and who's going to know what when. But the people who got that information were nervous and said, well, wait a minute, if there's something wrong with this and I can't sell it, I need to tell people. I'm going to tell my friends. Everybody, you say, don't say anything, and everybody always tells one person, right? And that's what happened. The information leaked. And so instead of being in control, the company lost control, because all of a sudden the media got wind of this and kept calling. What's happening? You're stopping sales. Why are you stopping sales? Why is the product not on your website? What are you doing about it? Of course, bombarding the front line, who had no information, didn't know what the narrative was, didn't know what to say. So it was very, very messy and created a whole bunch of unintended consequences for the organization, who had to take a minute, pause, reset, get their communications in order, understand that they had to go forward with their plan. And it took them a couple of weeks to recover from that situation that really didn't have to happen. But again, it was all from the point of a little bit of a fear and a control scenario.
And, adding to that, similarly on a control and fear, I think there was several years ago, there was a very large data breach that happened at a very large national retailer, and their instinct to share and be transparent came from a good place. However, it was one where they wanted to control the narrative and they wanted to be seen as being transparent. However, it ended up biting them because they weren't ready. Anyone who's been through a data breach knows you have a forensic team, you have to go through the data, you have to figure out what has been exposed, how big of a breach it is. It takes a little bit of time. You also have there's legal reasons on when you can tell things, and we tell the public. And this retailer wasn't really ready. Their forensic team, in my understanding, had not really finished the review yet. So they went with the numbers they had, I believe, to control the narrative and look transparent. Well, the numbers were wrong. And they went out and said, okay, well, it was, 1 million customer credit card data was exposed. Then a few days later, because the forensic team was still doing their due diligence, that number goes up. And now the company goes out and is like, oh, did we say 1 million? It's actually 1.8 million. And another week goes by. And again, due diligence is still going on. Then it's like, oh, wait, it's actually 3. The number gets worse. And by the time the third time that they've said the number, everyone's they're losing credibility, because it's like, well, what is it? And how do we believe you when what the final number is going to be? So there was another retailer that was a smaller one that had a breach around the exact same time, and they were very quiet about it. And granted, smaller piece of the market, but they didn't do that. They did what was legally required of them, but no such reputational issue. This very large one, unfortunately, the end result of their just again, it came from a control, but I believe also trying to be transparent, but you can backfire. The transparency thing can hit you like it did for this company. And the end result is the CEO and the head of comms lost their job. And you don't want to be in that position. So while it's always good, I always say, yes, we want to think about the consumer. And I think that's where this company was thinking about it. And their need to want to control the narrative and look a certain way, they ended up actually making it 1,000 times worse for themselves and for their consumers than had they just perhaps waited a beat and gotten their facts straight before rushing out with a bunch of information that wasn't correct.
Yeah, it's a great story. And there are so many unintended consequences. We see this happening all the time we'll talk a little later about postmortems, but we always see these unintended consequences. And that was a great example of that, what we were sharing. Another example of unintended consequences that we've seen, and it's inciting fear with not intending to incite fear. So we had a client who had never, a big consumer packaged goods organization who really never had a product recall, which is really amazing and wonderful. Having a product recall and being advised by the legal team that they had to make a statement about the issue with the product, which could produce bacteria because they didn't have something in the ingredient was missing that was normally in there. So something was a missing ingredient that could potentially cause the product to develop bacteria. So they wanted to pull it off the market. And there wasn't a lot of product on the market. But the legal team insisted that after they made the statement that they're pulling the product, that they lead with this statement about what could happen to you health-wise if it became a contaminated product. Now, they didn't have any contaminated product. They were pulling it off shelf and there were no reported illnesses. And they insisted on leading with that paragraph. And so any other information, any other checking to see if your product was impacted, any other call to action for the consumer, replacement product was really buried. And all everybody kept seeing was this threatening, scary commentary, which is important to say what might happen, but that probably could have been a frequently asked question or put lower in that information. It didn't have to lead with that. And so more claims came out of for this. More volume came because everyone was afraid, and it became very newsworthy because of that. Even though the product that they pulled from shelf tested negative for these pathogens that could happen but didn't happen. So the company created their own unintended consequences as a result of that. And if the consumer affairs person or someone had pushed back to say, yes, we understand legally we need to say these things and we should share this, let's just think about where we share, that probably would have gone a lot differently than it had.
And that happens a lot, and especially when you're dealing with things that your consumer brands get hit by the media far, far more than B2B companies. Mm-hmm. And whenever I'm working with a B2B company, it's like, they're like, oh, there's like 2 trades that cover us, so we'll find out. Because on Best Story, I've seen this 1,000 times where something just is a little complex, or there's 2 products that are kind of similar, but the issue is only with one product, and you really don't want to create like spillover to taint the other one, where it has to be very, very buttoned up and be very careful, because you can tripwire and suddenly create a bigger issue than you mean to, and really think through. I mean, part of my job as a crisis manager is to always look around corners. And if we do this, what does that trip off? If we say this, and so always thinking through the good and bad consequences, because it could be like the cybersecurity example that I gave with a retailer who thought they were doing the right thing and ended up backfiring because they shouldn't have given that out. There's other ones where they were in an effort to do one thing and perhaps contain it. It actually made it worse because it looked like they were hiding something and they didn't mean to. So there's all sorts of unintended consequences that can happen when you're dealing with these things. And it's hard when you're in a crisis because you oftentimes are just in that panic mode that Beth mentioned, which is why big believer in start your planning when you're quiet so you can think through these things, and there'll be fewer unintended consequences because you can think around the corners a bit more on, okay, if we do this, what does that do? If we say this, what does that do? Obviously, you can't plan for everything, but if you just take a beat and don't be panicked, this doesn't happen as often.
Exactly. And so sort of the way we kind of wrap up the human element is we think about it, about having grit, and what does that mean? So having integrity and accountability, and really that courage and perseverance and transparency overall is going to help you and really guide you in delivering what you want to deliver to for that consumer experience, and see you through this ultimately. We want to be sure we get to all. We have a lot of things to share. We focus an awful lot on this front end because that's usually where it begins. But let's talk about how you can approach this and what your strategy is to support a crisis. And we see it as sort of two parts. So are you going to be on the offensive, have an offensive strategy, or are you going to be defensive? And most crises are coming at you, and so you take a defensive approach typically. And like I say, the collective, we always see this. This is typically what's been happening. There's a way to kind of move from one to the other, and it's kind of interesting, especially now that there's so much direct to consumer work going on with brands. And there's an opportunity when you know who your consumers are to proactively reach out to them. So we've had occasion where we had a company who was recalling product. They know who bought the product because they sold the product directly. And we said, oh my God, what you could do is you could reach out to this known group and tell them, we need to get your product back or discard your product, and we're going to make you whole because we're going to either give you a digital compensation or however we're going to take care of you. And we'll let you know when the product's back on shelf. And what an elegant way to be able to handle that proactively. The consumer didn't have to do anything. Think about that level of loyalty that would build with that relationship, and how caring that is, and what a service experience overall. I mean, that's a wow if you could do that. The company didn't want to do that. They were very upset about that, and they were afraid to do that. And what happened was, in social media, things blew up for them, a little unintended consequence. And people said, I bought the product. Why are you making me do all of this? So they had to deal with it anyway. And it was a very good learning for them. I'm sorry that they had to go through that, but that did happen. So people have an expectation, especially when you have that direct relationship with them. Now, there's ways that companies you go buy a product in a store, they have a loyalty program. When you are recalling that product, that loyalty card says, they bought the product. The store is going to take your press release and either use the same language or condense it and tell their customers, your product was recalled, go do something with it, right? Whatever that call to action is. So that puts you on the defensive, even though they're proactively reaching out. But you have to have that whole strategy in place to be able to support what's going to happen and what you want the consumer to do. But you can move them into an offensive place because you can do a follow-up outreach. I mean, there's so much you could do. You've got all of this data that you're now collecting from your consumers, even though it's through a difficult time, you can so turn that around and build that loyalty in that relationship. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. What is the overall strategy? Maybe you're starting at one point, but you're certainly able to migrate, and it's a long process, not a long, could be long, might be short, but that process, you have time to turn that relationship around.
Yeah. And I think that I've seen many brands be able to make lemonade out of lemons on a crisis, where I worked with I have to be careful on how I describe this one, a very large company, and we'll say in the travel transportation business, who had made something where it was pushing a lot of cost onto its consumers. It was wildly unpopular. They changed something that was kind of seen as industry standard. And then they had a very high profile crisis, but it was a crisis where they were seen as being good stewards of safety, very well run. And the crisis ended up being such a amazing miracle that it actually rebounded. The company also quietly got rid of the things that were very unpopular. And it ended up becoming a very good thing for them. Their customer loyalty really bounced up because of the crisis, because of how they handled the crisis. So you can turn lemon into lemonade very much on how you handle it and how you take care of your customers. And as Beth's describing, I think, and sometimes there'll be a hit. I always say to my clients that you may take an immediate negative punch, but in the long run, it'll probably be better. If you can just get over the negative bump, there's sunshine on the other side. You just got to get over the little blip. I think all too often, sometimes companies are too afraid of the bump and aren't sort of taking the long view of things. It's like, oh God, what's going to hit us? It's like, take the hit and you'll live to fight another day. Because if you avoid the hit, sometimes that's 1,000 times worse, as we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And from a resources perspective, you need to be innovative with this and really sort of document, what is it going to look like? What is this consumer experience going to be that you're working on? And what do you want to see happen? So a couple of things. One is that whoever handles your customer care in your organization, whether you do that internally in your company or you do that externally with an outsourced partner, when it comes to an event, you have to decide who's going to own that. And are you going to isolate that event? And we strongly recommend that you separate a crisis from business as usual, because 100% of your consumers are not necessarily impacted by this crisis. The crisis typically could be for one particular brand or product. It is very rare that it's everything that you provide to the marketplace. So you want to isolate that crisis. And typically, most people partner with a provider or a segment of a population in your organization just to handle that crisis and let everybody else handle business as usual. So if that's going to happen, there's a lot of resources and things that people are going to need to make that successful. But initially, what does that look like? And what are the things and the information that you need to provide? So we recommend flowing out a crisis. And this is an example of things to care for in the course of an event. And one of the things that crisis teams always seem to say when a company reaches out and asks for, what do we do for customer care? I need 24/7 coverage. Oh my God, I have to have people available. Yes, you want to be able to have information for consumers on a 24/7 basis, but do you really need humans available 24/7? Not necessarily. You want to be able to answer questions. You want to be able to provide information, collect information, but you can do that on 24/7 with technology. And you want to give people a choice. We see that if you give people a choice, most people want to self-serve if the information in the self-serve process is easy and meaningful. And then you can speak to the people who you really need to talk to. So we find that when you leverage technology, you can take 70% of the volume and handle it in an automated fashion. And the 30% of the people who you really need to talk to, because they may have a claim, they have a question you didn't think about, they have some other, it's media, it's somebody else, whoever it may be, you want to talk to that 30% of the population potentially. So you want to care for frequently asked questions and answers, and whether you have that on the social site, your website, through a bot, in an automated voice recording, however you want to do it, you want to care for that. You want to be able to capture information, give information, collect information. People understand how to work with entering information and uploading pictures. Every single person has some kind of a device, right? So they know how to use that device, and you can make that device work for you in an event, and you should think about that. And then, of course, you want to have live agent as well. Maybe you want to expand your hours of operation. That's something for consideration in the beginning of an event, especially, and depending on the severity of the situation. But then you'll contract accordingly as things flow and as volume potentially decreases. And consistently, we see crises start, there's a rise, there's a spike, comes down, spike, and those spikes, if it's a product or because loyalty programs are telling people to call you and they're rolling that out on a different basis, and then sort of evens out and goes away. Unless you have media coverage, unless something blows up for you on social, unless you haven't been clear and honest and forthcoming and cared for things. So again, those unintended consequences, but typically that's what we see happening.
Yeah. And to add, I think that I love flowcharts for crisis plans, because really, if you just know how to get through the first hour or two of a crisis on what you're going to do, that really lowers the panic level when something happens. So thinking it through like that. And also on the, I'm just slipped my mind on what you were saying. Never mind. It'll come back to me. It literally just popped out of my head. Yeah.
It's okay. Little personal crisis, you'll get there.
Exactly.
But it'll probably come when we're talking here. So we were talking flow charts, and the other thing that we think is really important is to be sure that you, again, on your messaging, as we said in the very beginning, that you have to be sure you're caring for all of the appropriate members and stakeholders involved in your crisis. So again, if you're having the frontline, think about this, frontline people handling your most important conversations in the event of an event. And that's what happens, right? It's not your senior team taking contacts from people. It's the frontline people who may or may not know who you are, depending on who you contract with to do all of this work. So you want to be very scripted and prescriptive in what you're having people say and controlling that conversation, but in the way that's in line with your brand, your company culture. And so what is the message for the media? Because the media will call into your contact center and they will play your messaging on the air, and they will do all of that. So if you have a great communication plan to handle that, you're going to be okay. Your consumer affairs team, again, you should be calling them in. If you're a member of the crisis team and you're not reaching out to the team that you've put in place with that flow and listening and living that brand experience that you've created, that's a problem. You need to absolutely do that, because you're going to hear things and see things and say, this is what we wanted. This is great. Or yeek, we have to fix this, and then self-correct immediately. You can do that. The direct-to-consumer thing we talked about, your employees and everyone. So if every group, and there's probably more that are not here, has that plan, you're going to be able to control that narrative and that messaging that much better, and it's going to be more successful for you. And keep in mind, this is fluid messaging. It changes as the event changes, as new information comes in. You want to update information and materials. Maybe there was an FAQ you didn't think about that people keep coming up with. Get that answer, get that out there. Maybe the crisis has changed in some way. You're expanding it, or I don't think it's ever been reduced, but sometimes things take a right or left turn and you have to come out with more information. So it's real important that you care for that and cover that.
And to chime in on a few things on this page, on the employees, I think, Beth alluded to this, things can get leaked really easily. So you always want to sing from the same hymn book, but also sometimes I've actually worked for a few brands where they were not planning on telling their employee base about something that was happening, whether it was a deal, like a transaction they were doing or something, where I had one, it was a restaurant chain, and they were going through a large financial transaction that would be impactful to the entire company. And the C-suite was confused when I asked about when I presented the lit menu that I have of communications documents I was going to provide. Why would I include employee communications as part of that? And I said, I think they're going to care that you're switching from public to private, and you're going to be owned by private equity now. And, they listened to me and we did it. But it was interesting. There's blind spots on whether it's forgetting to tell consumer affairs or forgetting to tell employees. It's remember that first, not every event needs everybody involved, but for crisis and for, I would say, large transactions where people are worried about jobs, remember who will be impacted, because it goes back to that initial one on the human. Another stakeholder that you really hope you don't trip into is policymakers, regulators. And they're not on this page, but they're the ones that come into play if things go really sideways, whether obviously, if you have a recall, the CPSC is usually involved in things like that. The FDA, if it's a food or drug issue. But if something is low level and gets a lot of media attention, or you angered one really upset customer, they can start calling regulators and Congress people, and suddenly you've got them breathing on your neck. So you don't want to get there. That's sort of like the emergency, but just throwing that out there. And I remembered the thing that my brain decided to slip. It was the how to tell when a crisis is over. Obviously, calls going down to your call center, also media. And for any PR people, marketing people on the call, you probably do this already, media monitoring, social media monitoring. That's also a good litmus test. There's really good technology, AI out there now that can actually track conversations and see when it's really going down. That's another good way to tell, like, when is it leaving the conversation? And is it now going from 100 stories a day or 100 posts a day to like one or two, very small? Then you can probably say, okay, game over. We can move on and go back to peacetime.
Yeah. And that's a good segue into what we wanted to talk about next, because that is about recovery and change. And when do we call a crisis, call it over? And so in concert with the social monitoring and seeing that go down, you see your contacts overall going down. So less people are coming to your site or your bot, and calls and contacts and chats coming into the contact center. I was going to go back to that other one, Corey. So yeah, so and we'll talk in a second about the complete endpoint, but just to not give short shrift to the change and recovery, because you definitely can come back from an event and you need a comeback strategy. So being agile and being able to say, we're excited that the brand is back, the product is back. And by the way, you've collected all of this information from the people who've contacted you. So you could proactively reach out and say, listen, try the product. It's back on shelf. Here's a digital coupon. Go on us. Go give it a go. And you can monitor that because you're controlling that, so you can see the return and the purchases. And again, how you're building back loyalty. And obviously you have a whole communication strategy. So there's an elegant way to come back, because again, if you've treated the consumer appropriately during the course of this event, they're going to stay with you. And they're going to even call and say, when is it back? Let me know. I'm loyal. I want to have this. I love that when we hear that. And we like to bring those conversations into the crisis team and share them and say, listen to what the consumers are saying, because they are waiting for this thing to come back. They appreciated what you did for them. And then, of course, when do we say the event is over? And in the same way that you had the crisis team call the crisis, who on that team is calling the end of the crisis? So the crisis team isn't set it in the beginning and forget it. It's this team should be meeting on a regular basis. This team should be monitoring what's happening and staying with this all the way through to the very end. Looking at the metrics that we were talking about, as the mentions are going down, as the contacts are coming down, can you now reduce this so that it's gone completely, and maybe it's gone forever? Or in some cases, for legal reasons, you need to leave the number available, but you can put it in the background. You can put it in another place on your site. It doesn't have to be so prominent. And there's ways to elegantly wind down and pull that work into business as usual. Have talking points for your frontline team. Again, they're always the ones who are handling these things, but allowing them to assimilate that event back into normal work. So that's kind of how that flow would potentially go.
And sometimes on this, it's there at some point, or rather, I should say, at certain circumstances, it's actually useful to say, okay, crisis over, and actually maybe not issue a press release, but let certain groups know. You probably have seen with a lot of the COVID restrictions and rules that were going on, you're now seeing kind of the governments in the states actually saying, okay, we're not going to require this anymore. Things like that. That is their version of calling the crisis over, is when you start to see when they said, okay, no more mask. We're not requiring vaccines anymore. Now we're hit the 2-year mark. That's the government's very obvious version. Companies sometimes, depending on the crisis, will need to do something similar to let certain stakeholders know that, like, we're past this. We've made whole on the data breach. Sometimes it's a quick little line item in an earnings statement. Sometimes it has to be more, but just throwing it out there. Sometimes there is a public version that you have to do. Ideally, you just go quietly into the good night and it's done. but there are certain circumstances, usually when it's a material impact, where something a little more official has to be said as far as like stake in the ground, it's done.
Yeah, and then that's publicly, and then privately, what you need to be doing is a postmortem and reviewing what happened in this event that we just had. What went well? What did not go well? What are we learning? And with every single event, regardless of what the reason was for the crisis, there's a learning. There's absolutely something new that you didn't think about, or that we didn't behave the way you thought it would. The flow was different. The people were different. The calls were different, whatever it is. So learn from that postmortem. We had a client where they had a very disastrous, I would say, very first recall experience. It was really overwhelming for them. And because they didn't, this was the group that was controlling the narrative and didn't want to sort of let things out the right way. It was kind of an interesting, so the postmortem was interesting. We had to share some difficult information. We were very strong about here's what worked from the service perspective, here's what didn't work, here's what we'd recommend for next time. And then unfortunately, the group had another event, a smaller recall, but a different product, but something happened. They listened though. They took the postmortem advice and recommendations, and the second event was uneventful as much as it could be. So it was wonderful because we could see everybody had that learning, and it really was amazing. And one of the postmortems from that event was, look what happened. Because we shifted, because we listened, because we changed, this became a non-event, and we learned from that too. So I highly recommend that happens as well.
Absolutely. And update your crisis plan as part of that too. So.
Yes, critical. Absolutely. So we've covered an awful lot of things. Thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to share a lot of these best practices, and we wish you many more Maureen's on your crisis teams.
Well, thanks so much, Beth and Heather, for that presentation. So we've got time for a few questions. Just a reminder to any attendees, if there's a question, please submit it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be moderating those. But I'm actually happy to start us off. This is a really wide-ranging presentation covering the intersectionality of crisis and what you have to think about. 2023 has kind of been, I guess, one of the big breakout years for generative AI, and you talked a little bit about technology, but how specifically, should brands be thinking about leveraging AI and maybe other more novel technology into crisis situations for mitigation and maybe even potentially building their crisis plans proactively?
Yeah, so I think about two ways to carefully use AI during an event. I would absolutely highly recommend using a bot, a chat bot, and I would use generative AI with regard to that. And what I mean by generative AI is aligning that bot with a knowledge base where it's pulling information. So the consumer may be asking a question, and the bot is smart enough to go to that source, pull in the information, and give the response with, of course, human interaction and humans monitoring that conversation and making sure that anytime they want to opt out to someone, they can, but pulling the chat information with. So again, that's sort of in an automated way. I strongly do not recommend using OpenAI, not the company OpenAI, but just an OpenAI platform, a large language model, to answer crisis questions, because as we know from AI will always give you an answer. It will confidently be right or confidently be wrong, but it's programmed to give you a response. So in a crisis, you don't want the wrong response. So that's one way. The second way, which would be amazing for companies to do, is to glean the analytics from all of that, because you can now take 100% of the data that you're ingesting and leverage an AI tool, an analytics tool, to go ahead and help you see the insights and draw conclusions that manually you could do also, but it takes so long. So you can see real time what's happening and what the sentiment is and how your things are doing, and shift and adjust on the fly. So those would be two ways that I would immediately deploy AI.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think from the sort of the communications PR standpoint, AI is great for monitoring. It just expedites the process so much that in a way that humans can't. But you always need that human touch. For drafting, I add to Beth. It's generative AI is very cool. I play with it a lot. It does a lot of interesting things, but it is way wrong and has a far way to go. So it's interesting if you want to play with it and see how it works as far as drafting things, but please don't do it in times of crisis, because it is, to Beth's point, it's going to give you an answer. It won't necessarily be the right one. So I think in terms of drafting communications that are actually going to go to human beings, keep it human. Keep it human. Use AI for things that can expedite the process for efficiencies. But as far as drafting materials for your customers, for your employees, for your partners, leave it to the human beings for now. AI just isn't there on understanding us yet. Thank God. So. Yeah.
Speaking about understanding us, just another thing that kind of came up through the course of your presentation. We live in a time of immense polarization. I'm sitting just outside of our nation's capital, and so there's a lot of polarization here. When you have a client with, that is basically confronting a situation where there's kind of these social, political issues that may demand a response from two sides, and there's a potential polarizing answer, like how do you find the space in the middle to sort of help position the company on that potentially polarizing topic?
Yeah, and we're about to go into an election year, so it's going to get worse. What I tell my clients is, one, are you the right person to even be saying it? Because we've seen in certain social justice type situations, everyone and their mother starts chiming in, and it begins to lessen the impact, because it's like, oh, okay, everyone is posting on Instagram their little picture. So one, does it make sense for you and your brand to be even saying anything? Do you have a voice in this? Should you have a voice in this? And that could be yes or no questions. Only something you could answer. Do your leaders feel strongly? If they do, it could be, if you are X brand, it doesn't really make sense, but your CEO is very involved in that personally, there's a personal connection, then maybe the CEO does it personally. So I think there's different parameters under which you would do things. I think it just, a lot of thought has to go into before you start posting things or making comments about social or political issues, because things are so heated nowadays and you get canceled so quickly that it really needs to, should we even be doing this? Does it make sense? Is it on brand for us? Or do we have a personal connection? Does it fit with our values to do something? What are the unintended consequences if we say something? What are the unintended consequences if we don't say something? So I think there's a lot to think about, and it's going to be different for every company and every situation on that. So, and
I would just add, because on the front line in the customer service world and consumer affairs, you're going to be bombarded anyway, whether you make the statement or not sometimes. And so you have to arm your team with what to do. And so that is that statement of, tell us how you feel. We're going to collect that information and share it with the appropriate people in our organization. Or provide an automated way for your consumers to give you feedback. Go to a here's how I feel box or inbox or something, and maybe say, we're going to collect this info, we're going to share it with our team. You may not hear back from us. So at least you're giving people a forum to vent and say what they want to say. Whether you choose to jump in or not doesn't matter, but you have to arm your service team with something, because they may come at you anyway, even if you don't say something. So be prepared to live in that middle of that. We'll hear you, we'll ingest it, but we may not do anything with it kind of thing, and let your team feel that, hey, listen, somebody's collecting some of this. And sometimes you do want to have a look at it, because you may have to ultimately come out with something to say.
That's great insight. Just being conscious of the clock, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, but on behalf of Consumer Brands, wanted to thank Beth and Heather and Premier Response for this great material, really actionable strategies and stuff that hopefully our attendees can take back. And this presentation recording is going to be provided as part of our follow-up. But thank you all for joining today's session. Consumer Brands is going to be having some other industry insights scheduled throughout the remainder of the year. Just please visit our events and education education page to see what that content calendar looks like. But Beth and Heather, thank you all so much, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.